Hey everybody, thanks for checking in once again. Right, today I'd like to talk about background blur. There are, of course, lots of very fancy lenses and rather expensive lenses that you can buy that will make some really exquisite background blur. However, there are some rather cheaper lenses you can buy that will do very much the same thing. And those are the lenses we're going to be looking at today. First of all, let's talk a little bit about how you make blur and what are the factors needed to make some nice background blur from a lens and really get that blurry stuff going so that you can focus attention on your subject, which is really what blur's all about. So the first of those factors is your aperture. Generally speaking, the wider you open up your aperture, the more blur a given lens is going to give you. And this works for every lens, any lens ever made. The wider the aperture, the more blur you're going to get. So, for example, we've got here a Minolta 50mm f1.4, and there's the aperture in there. So there's f2, that will give you some nice blur, but f1.4 will give you even more blur. So that's a good thing to remember. The wider the aperture, the more blur you're going to get. There is a caveat though, the wider you open up your aperture, the wider your lens can go. Generally speaking, the more degraded the image is going to get. It's going to be less sharp. You're going to get more vignetting in the corners. That's not so true with modern lenses, but it's certainly true with vintage lenses like the ones we're dealing with. So this f1.2 55mm from Olympus here is a really good example of this. If you stop it down to f2.8, it's beautiful. It works absolutely fantastically. It's very, very sharp. It gives lovely blur. But if you open it up to f1.2, there are loads of compromises. The background blur gets very wild and the image starts to get a lot less sharp. So that's a compromise, and that holds for any lens. It's more true for vintage lenses though, so bear that in mind. The second factor is focal length, right? So along the lens, like, oh, whoops a daisy, along a lens like this 200mm lens here, this is quite a long lens. A longer lens will naturally give you more blur and inherently give you more blur than a shorter lens. So straight out the box, this is, what is this, an f4 lens? Yeah, this is an f4 lens. So this f4 lens, 200mm lens, will give you rather more blur in most situations anyway than this 50mm f1.4 lens will. So focal length is another factor in making blur. The longer the length, the more background blur you're going to get. The shorter the length, the less background blur you'll get. And you can see this with phone cameras. Phone cameras have very, very tiny little sensors, so they need very, very wide angle lenses, and so they don't have much inherent background blur. So that's why when you shoot an image with your mobile phone, almost all of it is in focus. The only exception is if you go very, very close to your subject, then you'll get some background blur, even with a phone camera. And that brings me on to the next element, which is distance to your subject. So the closer you are to your subject, again, this is true for any lens at any aperture setting, the closer you go to your subject, the more background blur you will find in your image. And that's because the lens is operating right at its maximum range. So if it's at its closest distance setting, it makes sense that things in the background, the further you go back, the more out of focus they're going to be. So simple rule, another simple rule, the closer you are to your subject, the more blur you're going to get. sensor size is the final factor, and the reason for that is the smaller the sensor, the wider lenses you need to give the same shot. So if, for example, I'm shooting on a full frame camera, a 50mm lens, well now if I wanted to get that same shot on micro four thirds, on a micro four thirds camera, I would need to use a 25mm lens, which is much wider. So that has, as we now know, inherently less depth of field, and that's why smaller sensors give you less blur. It's not that they're inherently less blurry. If I take this 200mm lens and I put it on my full frame camera, it will give me loads of blur. If I take this 200mm lens and somehow can adapt it to my phone camera, it will still give me the same amount of blur, but it will be a really, really, really long lens. It will have the equivalent of about a 10,000mm or something like that. So it'll be like a telescope. So it's not practical. So to get any practical shot from a camera with a very small sensor, you need a very wide lens, and that's why smaller sensors don't give you so much blur. Have we already said that? I don't know, but if that's so, I've now said it twice, so it must be true. You can make some really nice blur with a 50mm f2 lens like this one. This is the trusty old Pentacon Practicar 50mm f1.8. This isn't the world's best lens, but it's by no means the world's worst lens either. It's a very nice little lens, very cheap little lens, and it's a really practical solution. So a lens like this, a 50mm f2 or an f1.8, will give you blur and separation certainly close to your subject at the minimum focus distance, but maybe up to around 10 feet or so as well. If you're shooting on the street, if you're shooting a lens like this wide open on the street, well, you'll find that you get some blur and some separation from your subject up to around about 10 feet or so. So that's pretty nice. You can get a simple ordinary lens, a simple cheap lens like this one, and you can still get separation from your subject. It's not the blurriest lens in the world, but if you stay close to your subject up to, I don't know, around 3 feet or so, you will get some really nice blur. You can actually get some gorgeous blur out of this lens. And there are loads of other cheap 50mm that will do that for you. But yeah, generally speaking, if you stay closer to your subject, you're going to get some really lovely blur from a 50mm f2 lens. They're probably better for close-up work, like, I don't know, portraits or natural shots, shots of flowers, things like that, the natural world, if you're into that kind of thing. But a really good solution for getting some cheap blur up to about 10 feet or so. The 75 to 90mm range is what you might call the classic portrait length, and there are some beautiful vintage lenses in this focal length. The Pentax 85mm f1.8 is one such. That is a beautiful, beautiful lens. So is the Carl Zeiss Jena 85mm f1.8. That too is a beautiful, beautiful lens. But the prices of those lenses are not beautiful. They're rather expensive now. I think they're both around the £1,000 mark, which just shows you how much prices can go up of vintage lenses. Not long ago, you could buy the Pentax for £300 and the Carl Zeiss for £600. Now, I think, as far as I'm aware, they're both around the £1,000 mark. But you don't have to pay that much. I've got here a Nikon 85mm, or Nikkor I should say, 85mm f2. This is a lens I bought about 3 years ago, and I paid £80 for it at that time, which was a pretty good price. That's around about £1 per millimetre of focal length. They've probably gone up now, like most of these vintage lenses, and I think they're around about the £100 to £150 mark, but that's still a really nice cheap vintage lens in the classic portrait range. You can buy a Helios 40, which is one of the wackiest lenses I know. That's an 85mm f1.5. You can buy one of those for £300 to £400. So certainly around £100 will get you a Nikon. But you don't even have to go so expensive as that. There are other choices far, far cheaper if you go a little bit longer. For example, I've not long ago shot a beautiful Leica 90mm f4, one of the L39 mount lenses made for the Barnack Leicas. That gives you some nice blur. Even though it's an f4 lens, it doesn't have a very wide aperture. It's got the length to give you some blur even at longer distances. The Olympus 100mm f2.8, which I've got around somewhere. Where are you, Olympus lens? Here it is. This is the Olympus 100mm f2.8. This lens again will cost you around about £100. And this is a beautiful lens, a really, really lovely lens with really, really lovely blur. There are faster Olympus lenses in this length. I think there's an f2, which I shot a few years back, and that was even nicer than this one. That one's gorgeous, but that is very expensive. Other cheaper alternatives, well, let's go a little bit longer in the focal length range. Let's go now to 135mm, and if we go to 135mm, oh man, we really are spoilt for choice. Back in the day, every photographer who was worth their own salt had three lenses at the very least: a 28mm, a 50mm and a 135mm, and that was the standard photographer's set. You know, if you were a hobby photographer, if you were serious about it, you'd have your film camera there and you'd have those three lenses. Yeah, that's three lenses at the very, very minimum: a 28, a 50 and a 135. And because of that, there were loads of cheap 135s made. And because they were cheap, it does not mean they were bad. There's a lot of very, very fine lenses made in that focal length with apertures of around f3.5 from the major manufacturers. And here's one of my favourite ones. This is the Olympus OM Zuiko f3.5 135mm lens. This is just a beautiful lens, and I use this again and again and again. Don't worry about the f3.5 aperture. Some of them are f4 aperture. Don't worry about that either, because they've got enough focal length to give you the blurry stuff, right? They won't work too well in low light on a film camera, but that's really their only restriction. If you're shooting digital, whack up the ISO if the light's going and off you go. It doesn't matter. So, gosh, there are loads of lenses from manufacturers such as Olympus, Canon, Carl Zeiss Jena, Pentax, Konica, you know, you name it, everybody made one. Nikon, everybody made a cheap 135, and they were made to very, very high optical standards. They were cheap because they were f3.5. There's loads of them around, and you can buy a good one today for £40 to £60, probably less if you're patient. I've got a Pentax version. Absolutely love it. I've got this Olympus version. I've shot the Konica versions. I've shot the Carl Zeiss Jena versions. There's a Jupiter f4 135mm, a Jupiter 11. That's a fairly slow lens, but it doesn't matter because it's 135, and that's a really nice lens too, and a really cheap one. So there are lots of choices in this focal range, this range of focal length, 135, loads and loads of choices. You know, you're absolutely spoiled for choice, and there's just no limit to what you can do with these lenses. I often use longer lenses for portraits on the street, and I love using them for that. Candid portraits of people just doing stuff, just going about their business in everyday life, little snapshots of life, little tiny moments of being that, if you're lucky and if you shoot enough, have a magic. And I just love shooting street portraits with longer lenses. Now, if you want to go for the cheaper brands like Helios or Vivitar, there are some really nice 135mm f2.8 aperture lenses. Yes, so you've got some fast 135s available as well. So you don't need to stop at f3.5. These lenses, like the Helios, like the other one I mentioned, what was it, Vivitar? My memory's going. Those lenses were often made by well-known manufacturers who weren't major manufacturers, not the likes of Nikon and Canon, etc., but companies like Chinon, Vivitar, Tomioka, manufacturers like that who really knew their onions when it came to making lenses, really knew what they were doing and made some really, really good glass, but didn't have a fancy name to stick on it. So they're cheaper. They were cheaper when they were new, and they're still cheaper now. And you can get a nice f2.8 135mm that will make you even more blur than 135 f3.5 for really cheap, 20 to 40 pounds. So, you know, you really can't go wrong there. But why stop at 135? We can go longer. Why not try a 200mm lens? This is the Olympus Zuiko 200mm f4. This will give you some really major blur, and I've had some success using this on the street for portraits in a similar way to how I use the 135. They're fantastic for candid portraits, and because they're from major manufacturers, they're optically very nice and they're mechanically very nice as well. That's a silky smooth feel on that. And there are lots of these lenses. Every major manufacturer made one. Canon, Nikon, Olympus, gosh, I've forgotten, Konica, Minolta, you know, you name it. Any of the major manufacturers you can think of made a 200mm f4. Sometimes it's you get lucky and you find an f3.5. They're usually f4 in my experience, and they'll make you some beautiful blur because they've got that really long focal length. They're great for portraits, they're great for street portraits, they're great for nature photographs if you want to go and photograph birds or you know, something of that sort. So fantastic lenses, 200mm. They are quite large, that's the only thing, and they are quite heavy, so I've sometimes found them a little bit tiring to carry for long periods. That's really the only disadvantage that they have. But if you just want to make some blur, you cannot go wrong with a 200mm lens. So that is my guide to making cheap blur on a budget. Blur if you don't want to spend too much money. Remember the 4 factors. Aperture size, the wider you go, the more blur you get. Focal length, the longer you go, the more blur you get. Distance to subject, the nearer you are, the more blur you get. Sensor size doesn't change the blur characteristics of a lens, but does mean you need to use generally wider lenses to get the same shot. Those 4 factors are your guide to making nice, cheap blur. So thanks everybody for tuning in once again. If you've enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell. That would be really appreciated. Many thanks to subscribers for your support, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please do chuck us a sub. That would be very much appreciated. Many thanks to patrons who've given their support over the years, patrons who've just joined. Many thanks to you patrons who've been with us for a while, patrons who were with us who are not with us anymore. Everybody, thank you very much for your support. It is really appreciated. If you enjoy the content on this channel, you might consider becoming a patron yourself. You can do it over at www.patreon.com patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that from as little as $1 per month. So that's it from me for now. Thanks for watching, everybody, and if you're not doing anything next week at the same time, maybe tune in again for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.